After being convicted in the gruesome murder and dismemberment of a man earlier this year, today in court, a jury found 25-year-old Taylor Schabusiness did not have mental disease or defect when she killed a man during sex. She then cut up his body, and his mom later discovered his head in a bucket. Late yesterday, a jury convicted her on all charges she faced. Leading up to the trial, she also attacked her attorney during a hearing.
The basement was eerily quiet, but something felt off. A mother, Tara Pecan, stepped down the stairs, only to be met with a sight that would shatter her world. What she found in that bucket, what she discovered in the silence of her own home, was beyond belief. A head, her son's head, and it was just the beginning. What made Taylor Schabusiness commit such a horrific act, and why did it spiral out of control in the most chilling way? The answer is darker than you can imagine. Thank you for being here, but now that you know what happened, how can you look away? This story demands to be heard. Subscribe and stay with us as we uncover the chilling truth behind this crime. You owe it to the victims and to yourself. It was the early hours of February 23rd, 2022, when Tara Pecan woke to an unsettling stillness in her home. The night had been like any other, quiet and predictable, but something felt off. Tara had heard her son, Shad, return to the basement with his ex-girlfriend, Taylor Schabusiness, the night before, but hadn't thought much of it. He was an adult now, 24 years old, living his own life. Around 2:30 a.m, Tara was jolted awake by the sound of a door slamming somewhere downstairs. Groggy, she checked the time, 2:30 a.m, and felt a nagging sense of unease. The basement light was still on, casting a faint glow. Why hadn't Shad turned it off? Her concern grew. Reluctantly, she got out of bed and walked towards the basement stairs. She hadn't checked on Shad since he'd gone down earlier, but something told her she needed to. As she descended, she noticed a black bucket sitting at the bottom of the stairs, something she had never seen before. It was covered with a beach towel, as though someone had tried to conceal it. Tara's heart began to race. Her hands, shaking, reached down and lifted the towel. What she saw beneath it would forever alter her life. Inside the bucket, nestled in plastic, was a human head. Her son's head. The cold, lifeless eyes stared back at her, and the blood drained from her face. Frozen, Tara struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. Every part of her body screamed in disbelief. How could this be real? How could this be happening in her own home? Without thinking, she fumbled for her phone and dialed 911. Her voice barely a whisper, she said, I think I found my son's head." The dispatcher hesitated, unsure if it was some kind of mistake. But Tara wasn't hallucinating. This was no mistake. This was her son, and he was gone. The 911 operator assured her help was on the way, but Tara remained alone in the basement, unable to escape the horror before her. She had no idea what had happened to Shad, but the discovery was just the beginning of a nightmare that would consume her family. The answers were still far out of reach, and the darkness of the truth had only just begun to surface. Taylor Schabusiness wasn't always the monster people now know her to be. Growing up in Green Bay, she was once an ordinary teenager. She went to school, made friends, and had hopes for the future. But behind the seemingly normal exterior, her life was already unraveling. Her mother, Mara, struggled with alcohol addiction for years, and this toxic environment created a backdrop of emotional turmoil that would follow Taylor into adulthood. By the time she was in her early teens, Taylor had already begun to show signs of deep emotional distress, often lashing out in ways that teachers and family members couldn't fully understand. Her father, Arturo, did his best to provide for the family, but his efforts were often overshadowed by the chaos Mara's addiction brought into their home. Taylor's sense of stability was shattered when her mother unexpectedly passed away from liver cirrhosis when Taylor was just 11. The loss left a deep scar on her, one that she couldn't process at that young age. The grief, compounded by her mother's struggles, sent Taylor spiraling into depression and anger, emotions she had no outlet to express. As Taylor grew older, her behavior became increasingly erratic. She was diagnosed with ADHD, depression, and later bipolar disorder, but the prescribed medications never seemed to help. Instead of finding peace, she turned to substances to cope. By the age of 18, she was using marijuana, cocaine, and eventually methamphetamine, which took hold of her life and never let go. Her mental state deteriorated further as she weaned herself off her prescribed medications, believing she didn't need them, but the drugs only masked the pain inside her. Then there was Shad Theion, the man who would tragically become the victim in this horrifying tale. Shad had a different upbringing, one rooted in love, stability, and family. He was kind-hearted, dependable, and generous. Known for his warmth and the genuine care he showed his friends and family, Shad was the kind of person who would give you his last dollar if you needed it. He was not a man hardened by the world. Instead, he lived his life with an open heart, finding joy in the simple things, like woodworking and spending time with his family. Shad and Taylor's paths hadn't crossed much after high school, but in 2022, Taylor reached out to reconnect. Though Shad had moved on with his life, now working with his father and making a living, he never turned away from someone in need. He welcomed Taylor back into his life with the same compassion he always showed. Little did he know, his kind nature would set the stage for an unimaginable tragedy. Taylor's downward spiral was far from over, and Shad's decision to spend time with her would soon lead him into the darkest chapter of his life. On the night of February 21st, 2022, Taylor Schabusiness and Shad Theion reunited, the way old flames sometimes do, drawn together by a shared history, yet disconnected by the paths their lives had taken. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, just two people spending time together. But Taylor had changed. The drugs, the mental health issues, the trauma. Everything had built up in her, consuming her in ways Shad couldn't possibly understand. The evening started innocently enough. They drove around Green Bay, eventually ending up at an apartment where they used substances together. The tension between them was palpable, though neither spoke much about it. Shad, trying to be the compassionate man he had always been, didn't judge Taylor's drug use. But as the night wore on, something in her began to twist. A darkness that had been bubbling beneath the surface for years. Taylor's addiction to methamphetamine, along with her constant state of emotional instability, fed this chaos inside her. As the night deepened, the drugs kicked in. Meth made everything sharper, faster, more intense. Her mind raced, jumping from thought to thought, all while her emotions, already frayed by years of instability, spiraled out of control. What started as an evening of substance abuse would soon take a much darker turn. It was in the basement of Shad's mother's house where things fell apart. The two of them had gone down to the basement, as Shad often did when he needed privacy. But this time, it wasn't just about privacy. It was about something darker taking hold. Taylor's obsession with breath restriction, a dangerous act she'd experimented with before, resurfaced. As Shad lay on the mattress in the basement, Taylor became more intense, more erratic. She had a chain in her hands, and as she placed it around his neck, something inside her snapped. It wasn't enough for Taylor to just feel in control. She needed to see the power, to feel the rush of life, slipping away from someone else. Shad struggled, gasping for air, his body fighting to survive. But Taylor didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The chaos inside her took over, and she held the chain tighter, tighter still, until Shad's body went limp beneath her. What was once an intimate, dangerous game had escalated into something far worse. When she realized what she had done, when she saw Shad's face turning purple, blood dripping from his mouth, it didn't seem to matter to her. She hadn't just choked the life out of him. She had crossed a line from which there would be no return. She didn't call for help. She didn't even seem to care. Instead, she went further, her actions growing more grotesque. The crime wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. In the basement, the horror had only begun. What came next would leave the entire town of Green Bay in shock. But the question lingered. What drove Taylor to such an unspeakable act? And what, if anything, could have stopped it? What drove Taylor Schabusiness to commit such a horrific act? It wasn't just the drugs, though methamphetamine had a powerful hold over her. It wasn't just the trauma she had endured growing up, the instability, the loss of her mother at a young age. It wasn't even the mental health diagnoses that followed her. ADHD, depression, bipolar disorder. No, it was all of it combined, pushing her into a state of deep, unrelenting despair. Taylor's obsession with notorious figures like Jeffrey Dahmer became a disturbing fixation, one that merged with her own unraveling mind. She wasn't just fascinated by their acts of violence. She saw something in them that mirrored her own inner chaos. The fantasies of power, control, and darkness consumed her thoughts, distorting her reality. The drugs only amplified this unraveling. High on meth and disconnected from reality, Taylor's mind raced and her thoughts twisted further. Her grip on what was right and wrong slipped, leaving her vulnerable to acting on impulses she couldn't fully control. What started as a moment of vulnerability turned into a moment of terror. In that basement, Taylor wasn't just a victim of her circumstances, she was the perpetrator of something far darker. But was it madness, or something far more calculated? Tara had no idea that the last time she saw her son alive would be the night before. When she had kissed him goodbye, she never imagined it would be the last time she'd see his warm smile, his laughter echoing through their home. She thought he was just spending time with an old friend, his high school ex-girlfriend, Taylor. But nothing could have prepared her for what she would find in the basement that night. Tara's steps were heavy, almost as if the weight of impending tragedy pressed down on her. When she reached the bottom of the stairs and saw the black bucket covered with a beach towel, she had no idea the horrors waiting underneath. Her instincts kicked in, but kicked. Nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. As her hand trembled, she lifted the towel, and the world she once knew shattered in an instant. Inside the bucket was her son's severed head, staring back at her, lifeless and cold. Tara froze. Her body refused to let her process what her mind couldn't comprehend. Her heart raced in disbelief. She couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. The room seemed to spin around her, and time itself seemed to halt. She screamed, a raw, guttural sound, but no one could help her. No one could take away the image that was seared into her mind forever. This was her son, her flesh and blood, reduced to a cruel and unimaginable sight. That moment, that discovery, would haunt her for the rest of her life, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the police arrived at the house on Stony Brook Lane, the scene was already beyond comprehension. Tara, still in shock, could barely find the words to explain what she had discovered. Officers descended into the basement, where they too were confronted with a nightmare. Shad's dismembered body scattered across the room in a way that suggested something beyond mere violence. The initial shock quickly turned into a frantic search for answers. What could have driven Taylor Schabusiness, once a familiar face to the family, to commit such a gruesome act? The crime scene was as disturbing as it was perplexing. Body parts were found in various places, some hidden in the basement, others stuffed into plastic bags and tucked away in boxes. The forensic team moved carefully, documenting every piece of evidence. But what stood out most was the sheer brutality and disregard for human life. The dismemberment had been done methodically, almost as if it was a cold, calculated act rather than one born out of uncontrolled rage. But what truly disturbed investigators wasn't just the gore, it was Taylor's apparent lack of remorse. As they pieced together the timeline, they learned that Taylor had not only killed Shad, but had also driven around with his remains in her minivan. The items she had used to transport the body parts were as disturbing as the crime itself. Bags, boxes, and even a crockpot box, all holding pieces of her victim. The investigation took an even darker turn when detectives uncovered the chilling fact that Taylor had become obsessed with serial killers, particularly Jeffrey Dahmer. As the pieces began to fall into place, it became clear that this wasn't just a random act of violence. Taylor's obsession with death, her fascination with Dahmer's gruesome acts, and her psychological breakdown all played a role in the tragedy that unfolded in that basement. Taylor's behavior in the days following the crime was equally unsettling. She didn't seem to care about the magnitude of what she had done. In fact, when questioned, she described her actions in a disturbingly detached manner. The coldness in her voice as she recounted the brutal killing was jarring. To her, this wasn't a moment of regret. It was an almost casual recounting of something she had done. As the investigation continued, the big question lingered. Was Taylor Schabusiness simply a product of her mental illness and addiction? Or was she something far darker? Was she insane? Or was she a person capable of such horror and still able to function with chilling indifference? With every new piece of evidence, the truth seemed even more elusive, and the story continued to unravel in ways no one could have predicted. The courtroom became the stage for a highly charged public spectacle. Taylor Schabusiness, once a familiar face in the community, was now at the center of a trial that captured the nation's attention. The prosecution presented a chilling case, showing not just the brutality of Shad Theion's murder, but the disturbing lack of remorse from Taylor herself. Her confession, captured on tape, left little doubt about her involvement. The way she recounted the details of the murder, almost casually, sent waves of shock through the courtroom. As the trial unfolded, emotions ran high. Shad's family sat in the front row, devastated by the public airing of their loved one's tragic end. For them, the trial wasn't just about justice. It was about coming to terms with the loss of a young man whose life had been stolen in the most horrific way. They listened as the prosecution laid out the details of the crime, the dismemberment, the body parts scattered across the basement and in Taylor's minivan, and the chilling absence of any genuine remorse. But the defense team was equally determined to make its case. Taylor's attorney argued that her mental state was a significant factor in her actions. They painted a picture of a woman who had been ravaged by years of mental illness, trauma, and addiction, leaving her unable to fully comprehend the gravity of what she had done. Was she capable of first-degree homicide, or was her mental state so compromised that she couldn't be held fully responsible? As the jury listened intently, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The question wasn't just about guilt, it was about justice, and whether Taylor would be held accountable for her actions, or whether her troubled past would absolve her of the consequences. Would the jury believe she was insane, or would they find her capable of the monstrous act she had committed? The uncertainty hung in the air, and the stakes had never been higher. The trial reached its final moments in a tense courtroom filled with anticipation. The jury deliberated for days, weighed down by the overwhelming evidence against Taylor's Schabusiness and the chilling details of the crime. When the verdict was read aloud, the courtroom held its breath. Taylor was found guilty of first-degree homicide, a unanimous decision that echoed through the walls of the courtroom. The weight of the conviction seemed to land not just on Taylor, but on everyone present, especially Shad's family. Taylor's punishment was life in prison without the possibility of parole. The relief was palpable among the Theion family, knowing that Taylor would never have the chance to harm anyone again. Justice, they thought, had been served, but even as the gavel struck, marking the end of the trial, a deep sadness lingered in the air. Shad's family, though grateful for the conviction, knew that no sentence could bring him back. No punishment could undo the horror he had endured. As the courtroom slowly emptied, the Theion family quietly filed out, carrying with them the memory of their beloved Shad, a memory that would never fade, no matter how many years Taylor spent behind bars. Justice had been delivered, but the pain of loss would never go away. Taylor Schabusiness' story is not just about a brutal crime. It's a reflection of the darkness that can grow in the shadows of addiction, trauma, and a fractured mind. It's a sobering reminder of how deep emotional pain can lead a person down a path of destruction, not only for themselves, but for those around them. The tragic loss of Shad Theion, a life snuffed out too soon, underscores the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness and the dangers of unaddressed trauma. This case leaves us with a haunting question. How far can a person fall before there is no coming back? Where do we draw the line between accountability and a broken mind? And, in the end, what happens when society fails to intervene in time? As we reflect on the horror of this crime, we must also ask ourselves how we can prevent such tragedies in the future, ensuring that no one is left to spiral into darkness alone. The story of Taylor and Shad is a tragedy, but it is also a call for greater understanding, compassion, and intervention in the lives of those who are lost.